Now, I know I mentioned early on that I was a Baptist Methodist of Christ, but I didn't mention that I was a Southerner. We have a couple friends in the house. And when I moved to New England, I recognized that there were a few differences. I'd like to come back to CCB, so I'm going to move along at this point in the sermon. But I found when I came to this conference that the people of the Connecticut Conference of the United Church of Christ were some of the most compassionate, some of the most giving, some of the most committed Christians that I'd ever met, with ministries that spanned across the globe, giving that impacted the lives of millions of people, some of which we will never see and never know. I recognized that we had built thousands of houses through Habitat for Humanity, had sent hundreds of children all across the United States to be engaged in mission and ministry work. We had bought more cookies and cakes and pies than the law allowed to pay for it. But yet, sometimes in the context of worship, it was hard to feel, to see, to understand where that passion was coming from. Because in New England, we spend a lot of energy focusing on the intellect, and we are engaged in action because we know it is the right thing to do. Because we have been taught that it is our responsibility, that to whom much is given, much is required. And we have taken those lessons seriously, and we have moved based on our thought. But I think that the other reason why God speaks to the Israelites about the heart is because he recognizes that when we work only from the mind, there can be a weariness in our work. Even if it is born out of our passion, even if it is born out of our love, or if it is born out of our pain, there can be a weariness that comes when it is only born through our thought. No, we must also learn to connect to our hearts, to be moved to action because of something we feel, because of our love. And that movement to action will in times look very, very foolish. It will not make sense in all moments to reach out to the stranger. There are some times when the act of injustice appears not to affect us and it seems foolish to be an ally. There will be times when the word of reconciliation and hope and forgiveness seems too soon, too quick, too challenging. And yet this word from God is an invitation for us to be moved by this word that now inhabits our hearts to do it. To get our hands connected to our hearts, that we might make a difference in this world. When I was in seminary, I had the privilege of being taught by this amazing minister. He was a professor of Christian education. His name was Dr. Jonathan Jackson, and he used to have this way of starting all of our classes that I never forgot. He would start every single class with this song. Christian education is that ministry that supports and undergirds every ministry of the church. And every single class he would say it, and he would go through the whole thing, and after a while we would start to say it too. Christian education is that ministry that supports and undergirds every ministry of the church. And he was such a revered and respected professor on our campus that as he would walk down the halls, you could always tell the students who had been in his class. Because as he would walk by, folks would start to say, Christian education is that ministry that supports and undergirds every ministry of the church. And he would sort of bow. And the students would bow back, and it was this wonderful moment to celebrate this man who had given so much of his ministry in our midst as seminarians. And it was a wonderful moment for me, and I had him my very first semester in seminary. And during the Christmas break, after I had him and I had learned the song, Christian education is that ministry that supports and undergirds every ministry of the church, I traveled with my family, and I went to see my great-grandfather, minister that I mentioned, who's Baptist. And I had grown up my whole life traveling to Florida to his house. And And all across his walls, there were these black and white photos that I, quite honestly, never paid any attention to growing up. I mean, they were black and white after all. What were they? Created before time or something? I didn't. But on this particular visit, my great-grandfather was filled with so much pride and joy because you see, in his 65 years of ministry, no one else in our family had entered the ministry. And so when I came there after my first semester of seminary, he realized that the family business was going to continue in me, and there would be someone else from his family that was sharing in ministry, that was preaching the gospel, and he was thrilled to see me, and he gave me this huge hug. And we talked and we walked around the house, and we looked at those black and white photos, and as I looked at one of the photos, I saw the corner of a building that looked just like a building in a watchtower on my seminary campus. And I said, that looks familiar. Where was this picture taken? And my grandfather said, in Georgia, in Atlanta. And I said, really? And as I looked closely at the picture, I saw a man who looked like Dr. Jonathan Jackson. Christian education is that ministry that supports and undergirds every ministry of the church. And I looked, and there standing behind him was my great-grandfather, Reverend Jesse Baldwin. And I looked at that picture, and I was amazed. It had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. And I'd never seen it, never looked at it, never even paid attention to it. Well, after that Christmas break, I asked my grandfather if I could take that picture back to school with me. And I got that picture, black and white, in the same original frame, and I went back to campus, and I saw Dr. Jonathan Jackson, and I said, first, Christian education is that ministry that supports and undergirds every ministry of the church. And then I bowed. And then I showed him the picture of my great-grandfather, and he's standing there, and we talked about it, and he was so proud. And that picture went all over my campus, and everybody knew the story about how my great-grandfather had come to the school, and how he knew Dr. Jackson, and how it was the semester that I was there, and then the Christmas, and then I met him in the picture, and everybody knew. We were all excited about it, and not that long after, my great-grandfather passed away. And I went to the funeral, and I came back to school. And the first day I came back to school, my choir director said we had to sing in chapel. And she asked me to sing a lead I had sung all semester. When she asked me to sing, I thought in my mind, this is the most inconsiderate thing you have ever asked. Everybody knows the story about my great-grandfather. They all know about Dr. Jackson. You know Dr. Jackson. Christian education is that ministry that supports and undergirds every ministry of the church. How in the world did you ask me to sing in the midst of my grief? Why would you ask me to give when I need someone to give to me? Why would you invite me to participate in ministry in the very moment when I need someone to minister to me? When I've experienced this loss, I've just come to know him, and I've just met him, and I've just recognized this connection that we share. How could you ask me to do this? I thought. I didn't say it. She was my professor and choir director. But as I began to sing that song, Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart. In my heart, Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart. My grief turned to joy, because I recognized in that moment of ministry I was more connected to my great-grandfather than in any other moment. That when I stood with him singing in that moment, that even though what motivated me in the beginning was my grief and my experience of loss, what kept me was my joy. That we shared this great ministry. We did this work together. And that whether it was the joy of knowing that he had done it for 65 years, or the sorrow I felt in knowing that he would not do it any longer, it was okay for him to go. because he knew I would carry on. In my heart, those words had been written in my heart. That covenant had been experienced in my heart. And so I could do something with it. Sometimes, in the moments when we are most moved by our hearts, we are called to do something. And we may feel in that moment that this is not the time to call on us to do something. But it is in the act of doing that we are reminded that we share in this ministry together, and it is in that sharing that we are made whole. Thanks be to God. Amen.